The carriage door had not even fully opened when the housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, looked Clara Voss up and down, with the practiced eye of a woman who had been judging people for 40 years and had never once been wrong, or so she believed. Clara stepped onto the gravel drive of Ashmont Hall with a single leather bag in one hand and a calm face that Mrs. Doyle immediately mistook for stupidity. Quiet people, in Mrs. Doyle's experience, were either deeply wise or entirely empty. She had already decided which category this gray-dressed young woman belonged to. The year was 1887. The month was April, and the English countryside was doing what it always did in April, pretending to be warm while the wind said otherwise. Clara pulled her coat a little tighter, not from cold, but from something closer to gathering herself. She had traveled for 11 hours by rail and then 2 more by road, and she had spent most of that time reading. The book, a collection of Cicero's letters in the original Latin, was now carefully tucked at the top of her bag. She had not mentioned it to anyone. There had been no reason to. Ashmont Hall rose before her like something from a painting. It was enormous. 3 floors of pale stone, ivy climbing the east wing, windows tall and evenly spaced like watching eyes. The ground stretched in every direction, trimmed and deliberate, the kind of landscape that did not happen by accident, but required a small army of gardeners, and the kind of wealth that never had to announce itself because everything around it did the announcing. Clara had grown up in a 4-room house next to a church. She had seen large estates before, but only from roads, and always moving past them. She stood still for exactly 2 seconds, taking it in. Then she walked forward. Mrs. Doyle led her through the servants' entrance without comment, which was not rude in itself. It was simply the correct procedure for a new governess. But the housekeeper's silence had a particular quality to it, a kind of practiced indifference that said she had seen many women like Clara come through this door, and many women like Clara eventually leave through it, usually within the year. "You'll be in the East Wing," Mrs. Doyle said, leading her down a corridor that smelled of beeswax and old wood. "Your room is above the schoolroom. You'll take your meals separately, unless instructed otherwise. The children eat at noon, and again at 6. You are responsible for their morning lessons from 8:30. Lord Harcourt does not involve himself with the schoolroom. He is a busy man and has no patience for interruption." Clara listened without writing any of this down, which seemed to irritate Mrs. Doyle slightly, as though the act of not taking notes was itself a form of defiance. "Do you have questions?" the housekeeper asked. "Not yet," Clara said. Her voice was steady and unhurried. Not loud, not soft, simply present. Mrs. Doyle showed her to her room, which was small but clean, with a single window looking out over the kitchen garden. There was a writing desk, a narrow bed, a wardrobe, and a bookshelf that was empty. Clara set her bag on the bed and looked at the empty bookshelf for a moment. By the end of the week, it would not be empty. The children were introduced to her that afternoon. Eloise Harcourt was 8 years old and had the kind of eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Clara the way children look at things they are not sure whether to trust, steadily, and with their whole face. She had brown hair and ink on 2 of her fingers, which Clara noticed and did not mention. Her younger brother, George, was 6, and spent most of the introduction hiding partly behind Eloise, while making it very clear that he was not hiding at all.
"Are you clever?"
Eloise asked. It was her first question. Not "what is your name?" Not "where are you from?"
"Are you clever?"
"I try to be," Clara said. Eloise considered this. Our last governess was not clever. She only knew how to do sums and read in one language. "Which language?" Clara asked. "English," Eloise said, as though this were an embarrassing confession on the governess's behalf. "And what would you like to learn?" Clara asked. The girl blinked. No one had asked her that before. Every governess she had known arrived with a plan already made, a schedule already written, a list of things Eloise was going to learn whether she wanted to or not. Clara was standing in front of her, genuinely waiting for an answer. "I want to know how people talked before English existed," Eloise said finally. Clara smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. "Then we'll start there." George, from behind his sister, said nothing, but he moved 2 inches closer. The first week at Ashmont Hall passed in the way first weeks often do, in a kind of careful observation, everyone watching everyone else from a polite distance, no one yet sure of the shape things would take. Clara taught the children every morning, with a patience that was not the forced patience of someone trying very hard to be calm, but the natural patience of someone who found genuine interest in the way a young mind worked. She did not talk down to Eloise. She did not talk above her either. She found the level where the girl lived and met her there. By the third day, Eloise was asking questions Clara had not expected until the second week. By the fifth day, George had stopped hiding behind his sister. By the end of the week, Clara had borrowed 3 books from the household library, replacing them neatly each time, and had stayed up past midnight 2 nights in a row, reading by the light of a single candle. The books she chose were not the light novels that lined most of the library's public shelves. She went past those, past the histories and the biographies, to the section that held texts in French and German and Italian, shelved together, as though the household had not known quite where else to put them. She read them all in their original languages. She took no notes. She did not need to. The library incident, if one could call it that, reached the housekeeper through Agnes, one of the younger housemaids, who had gone in to dust the shelves one morning and found that 3 volumes, one in French, one in German, one that Agnes could not even identify, had been moved, used, and returned. Agnes reported this to Mrs. Doyle with the air of someone reporting something slightly suspicious, though she could not quite say why it felt suspicious. It simply did. A governess had no business with foreign books. Mrs. Doyle, in turn, brought it up with Lord Harcourt during his morning briefing, which was a 15-minute meeting she held with him each day, to address any matters concerning the household's running. She framed it in the most neutral terms she could manage, which still contained within it the unmistakable suggestion that something odd was going on. "The new governess has been using the library, my lord," she said. "The foreign section." Lord Edmund Harcourt was standing at his desk, reviewing correspondence. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, beginning to show a little gray at the temples. He was 41 years old, and carried the particular kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from having spent a lifetime in rooms where other people came to him. He read his letters, the way he did most things, with full attention for a short time, and then the matter was resolved, and he moved to the next one. He looked up from his letter, and Mrs. Doyle paused, and she returned the books, my lord, correctly, but they were in French and German. Were they damaged? No, my lord. Then I don't see the difficulty, he said, and returned to his letter. Mrs. Doyle withdrew, but the information stayed with her, the way small, odd facts sometimes do, when they do not fit neatly into the picture one has already formed of a person. Clara, for her part, knew nothing of this conversation. She had simply read the books because they were there, and she wanted to, in the same way she had been reading books all her life, with complete focus and very little noise. Her father, Reverend Arthur Voss, had spent the first 12 years of Clara's life moving across Europe as a missionary, taking his family with him to France, then Germany, then Italy, then back to France, then briefly to Switzerland, before returning to England when Clara was 14, with failing health and a depth of experience that his modest Anglican congregation in Somerset would never quite know what to do with. He had been a gentle man, and a serious one, who believed that language was not merely a tool for communication, but the very structure through which a mind understood the world. He had taught Clara to read in English before she was 4. By 6, she was reading in French. By 9, she had added German and Italian, and somewhere in between, Latin had arrived as a matter of course, because her father was studying it himself, and she had simply joined him. She did not think of her languages as remarkable. They were simply the rooms she moved between in her own mind, each one furnished differently, each one offering a slightly different way of seeing the same world. French made her precise, German made her structural, Italian made her feel things she did not always have English words for. Latin gave her the past. She had never had much occasion to use them at Ashmont Hall. There was no need. She taught English grammar and arithmetic and history to 2 children in a schoolroom that smelled of chalk and old paper. She was polite to the other staff. She stayed out of the way. But the languages were there, beneath everything, like a deep river under a quiet field, invisible from the surface, always moving. The other members of the household staff settled into their own opinions of Clara over those first weeks. Agnes found her strange but harmless. The cook, Mrs. Garland, approved of her, because Clara always cleaned her own plate and never complained about the food. The footman, Peter, did not think about her much at all. The butler, Mr. Holt, observed her with the same detached thoroughness with which he observed everything, and concluded that she was either very simple or very reserved, and that he would know which, eventually. What none of them knew, and what Clara had no reason to tell them, was that she had turned down 2 other positions before this one. The first had been with a London family, who paid better, but whose children she had met during the interview, and recognized immediately as deeply unhappy. The second had been closer to her own town, comfortable and familiar. She had chosen Ashmont Hall not for the wage, which was modest, and not for the prestige of an earl's household, which she found neither impressive nor intimidating, but because the position had mentioned in its notice that the household library was extensive and unrestricted for household use. She had read that line twice, then she had written her letter of application. Eloise, by the second week, had begun telling Clara things she had not told any previous governess. Small things at first, that she liked the smell of old books better than new ones, that she thought the garden was more interesting in winter than in summer, that she found arithmetic boring, but could do it faster than anyone gave her credit for. Then larger things, that she missed her mother, who had died 4 years earlier, and that she missed her in a particular way she could not explain. Not a sharp pain, but more like a room in the house that she knew was there but never opened. Clara listened to all of this without trying to fix any of it. She did not say, "I understand," or "it will get better," or any of the things adults say to children when they want to close a difficult conversation. She simply listened, and when Eloise had finished, she said, "Tell me more about the room." Eloise looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The room you just described, the one that's always there. What does it feel like to walk past it?" The girl was quiet for a moment. "Like knowing someone is sitting on the other side of the door," she said slowly, "and you could knock, but you don't, because you're not sure what it would feel like if the door opened." Clara nodded. "That is not a sad thing," she said. "That is love. Love that has nowhere to go sits very still and waits. It is not suffering. It is patience." Eloise did not say anything to this for a long time. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to the history passage they had been reading, and her handwriting for the rest of the lesson was unusually careful, as though she were writing something she wanted to keep. Lord Harcourt himself, Clara, had seen 3 times in 2 weeks. Once, passing through a corridor when he was descending the main staircase, and she was crossing toward the kitchen with a stack of books. He had not looked at her. She had stepped to one side without needing to be asked, which was correct protocol, and he had passed without acknowledgement. The second time had been at a distance. She had been in the kitchen garden with the children, and he had appeared on the terrace above for perhaps 2 minutes before going back inside. The third time he had come to the door of the schoolroom, opened it, looked in briefly, seen that everything appeared to be as it should, and closed it again. In none of these 3 encounters had he spoken to her or appeared to notice her specifically. She was part of the household machinery, well-oiled and functioning, and the machinery did not require his attention. This did not bother Clara. She had not come to Ashmont Hall to be noticed by its owner. She had come to do her work, and the work was good. George, by the end of the second week, had started asking her questions that had nothing to do with lessons. He wanted to know why rivers flowed in one direction. He wanted to know why dogs could smell things people could not. He wanted to know whether the Romans had been afraid of thunder, or whether only the Greeks were, because he had read something about the old stories, and was now curious about whether the same fears appeared in different civilizations. Clara answered every question with the same seriousness she would have given to questions from anyone twice his age. She did not laugh at his curiosity. She explained the difference between how 2 cultures understood the same sky, and why both explanations were interesting, and why it was a sign of intelligence that he had noticed the connection. George went to bed that night very satisfied with himself, though he would not have been able to explain exactly why. The empty bookshelf in Clara's room was no longer empty by the end of the second week. She had arranged 11 books on it, 3 borrowed from the library, 5 she had brought with her, and 3 more that Mrs. Garland had found in a box in the attic and donated with casual generosity, saying she had no use for them herself. Looking at the shelf before she blew out her candle each night, Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not happiness exactly, something quieter than that. The particular calm of a person who is exactly where they ought to be, doing exactly what they were made for, even if no one around them has yet fully understood either of those facts. That understanding, she knew, would come, or it would not. Either way, she would be here, doing the work. That was enough. For now, that was more than enough. Outside her window, the kitchen garden was dark and still, and somewhere deep in the grounds, an owl called once and then went silent. Ashmont Hall breathed around her in the way large old houses do, settling, creaking, living in the way that wood and stone live after decades of human warmth pressed into them. Clara closed her book, closed her eyes, and the first chapter of her time at this place slipped quietly into the past. She would not know, lying in that narrow bed, that in 3 weeks she would stand in a grand drawing room in front of 12 of England's most titled guests and say something that would change everything. She had no way to know that. No one tells you when you are 3 weeks away from the moment your life turns. She only knew the owl, and the dark, and the full and busy quiet of her own mind, and that tomorrow Eloise had asked to learn about the ancient world, and that George had a question about rivers that deserved a proper and careful answer. She slept well. The schoolroom at Ashmont Hall was not a grand room. It sat in the east wing on the second floor, between a linen cupboard and a small sitting room that no one used, and it had the particular character of a space that had been designed without much thought, and then shaped by whoever happened to occupy it. The previous governesses had left their marks in small ways. A set of alphabet cards pinned unevenly to one wall, a map of England with a tier along the Scottish border, a row of arithmetic primers that were perfectly aligned, in a way that suggested they had been placed there for appearance rather than use. Clara had rearranged all of it within the first 4 days. The alphabet cards came down, not because they were wrong, but because Eloise was 8 and had no need of them. In their place, Clara had put a printed map of Europe, slightly larger, showing not just borders but cities and rivers and mountain ranges, the kind of map that told you where things were in relation to each other rather than just where they were in isolation. She had ordered it on a small discretionary budget Mrs. Doyle had told her existed for schoolroom materials, writing the request in a careful note that she submitted through the proper channels. The map arrived within 5 days. Eloise spent an entire afternoon standing in front of it, tracing rivers with her finger. The arithmetic primers stayed on their shelf, but Clara had added next to them a small collection of history texts, a natural science guide that George found so interesting he tried to take it to his bedroom 3 times, and a slim volume of classical mythology that had been in her own bag since the journey. The mythology book was well worn. Its spine had been replaced once, and the pages were soft with use. It had been her father's. She had carried it with her since she was 12. She had also moved the 2 desks. Previously, they had been placed side by side facing the wall, which she found an unusually discouraging arrangement. 2 children sitting next to each other facing a blank surface, like small people in a waiting room. She turned them, so they faced each other across a small gap, with her own chair at the end forming a triangle. This meant the children could see each other while working, and could see her without craning. Small things, but rooms teach you things before the person in them says a word, and she wanted this room to teach the children that thought was something you did together, not alone and in silence. Mrs. Doyle had come to inspect the schoolroom at the end of Clara's first week, and had stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the rearrangements. She did not say anything directly critical. She said, "Lord Harcourt's previous staff kept things in a particular order. The children learn better this way," Clara said. A pause. "You're very certain of that?" "I've had some experience," Clara said, which was true and modest, and told Mrs. Doyle almost nothing. The housekeeper left. Clara went back to preparing the next morning's lesson. By the 3rd week, a rhythm had taken hold. The mornings were for lessons, structured but never rigid, moving between subjects the way a good conversation moves, following the interest of whoever was asking the most interesting question. The afternoons belonged to the children in a freer way. Clara was present, but directing less, watching more, sometimes reading in the corner, while Eloise drew, or George built things out of blocks with an engineer's seriousness. Clara was good at being present without hovering, which was a skill that many adults who worked with children never quite managed. She had learned it from her father. Reverend Arthur Voss had been the kind of man who could sit in the same room as his daughter, while she did something entirely her own, and make her feel both completely independent and entirely safe. He did this not through any deliberate technique, but simply because he was genuinely interested in people, and therefore never had to pretend to be. When Clara was working on something, he worked on something too. When she wanted to talk, he put his work down. When she wanted to be quiet, He was quiet with her. She had not realized until she was grown how rare this was. He had died 2 years before she came to Ashmont Hall. A cold that had turned to something in his lungs, which the doctor had said was not treatable in any way that would have made a difference. Clara had spent the last months of his life reading to him, first in English, then in French when he was tired, because French had always been his favorite language to hear, then in Italian, when even French was too much effort, and he simply wanted the sound of something beautiful. He had died on a Tuesday in November, quietly, with her hand in his, and the Italian still soft in the room around them. She did not tell Eloise this story, but when the girl talked about her own mother, Clara understood in her body what Eloise was describing. She understood it in a way that did not need explaining. The 3rd week brought rain, several days of it, heavy and consistent, which meant the children could not go outside in the afternoons, and the schoolroom became the whole world for longer stretches than usual. George became restless on the 2nd day, then creative on the 3rd, and by the 4th he had built an elaborate structure from books, blocks, 2 rulers, and a piece of string that he explained was a model of an aqueduct, inspired by something Clara had mentioned while teaching about the ancient world. Clara studied it seriously. She found one structural problem and pointed it out with precision. George corrected it. The aqueduct held. Eloise, during the same rainy days, had developed a sudden and complete interest in the French language. This had happened not through any formal introduction on Clara's part, but because Eloise had found, in the mythology book, a passage in French that Clara had written in the margin years ago, a note to herself about the difference between certain ancient understandings of fate, translated from a Latin source she had been reading at the time. Eloise had stared at this marginal note and then looked up. "You wrote in French," she said. It was not quite an accusation, and not quite a question.
"I think in French sometimes," Clara said simply, "when I'm thinking about certain things." "Which things?"
"Things about how ideas move from one person to another across time." Eloise turned this over. "Can you teach me French?" "I wasn't asked to teach you French," Clara said. "I was asked to teach you reading, writing, arithmetic, and history." "But could you?" Eloise pressed. "Yes," Clara said, "I could." Eloise set the mythology book down. "Then let's do that too." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "We'll need to tell Mrs. Doyle, and she'll need to ask your father." The request went up through the proper channels. Mrs. Doyle took it to Lord Harcourt, with the air of someone delivering a mildly surprising piece of news. His response was brief. The request was granted. No comment was made about why the governess was capable of teaching French, or what this implied about the woman he had hired to look after his children. It was granted the way decisions about the schoolroom were always granted, efficiently, without much thought, because the schoolroom was not something Lord Harcourt concerned himself with. Clara began teaching Eloise French the following morning. She taught it the way her father had taught her, not through lists of vocabulary memorized in isolation, but through stories. She began with a short, simple story about a girl who found a door in a wall and discovered it led to a garden she had not known existed. She read it aloud in French first, slowly, giving each word its full sound. Then she read it again, and this time she paused to ask Eloise what she thought a word might mean, based on the sounds around it. Eloise guessed. She was right about half of them. Clara praised the half she got right, and explained the other half with the same energy, making it clear that guessing and being wrong was part of learning and not something to avoid. By the end of the week, Eloise could say 15 sentences in French and understood their meaning without needing to translate them into English first, which Clara explained was the real sign that a language was beginning to work inside you. George had meanwhile begun his own project, entirely self-directed. He had decided that ancient civilizations were more interesting than anyone else in history, and had started a small journal, 3 pages of it so far, in which he wrote down things he learned that he found remarkable. He showed it to Clara on Friday afternoon, with the pride of someone presenting a finished work that had taken him great effort. She read it carefully, all 3 pages. There were 6 spelling mistakes, and 1 misunderstood date. She mentioned neither of these things at the time. She told him that the observation he had made on the 2nd page, about why the great builders had constructed roads that went straight, instead of curving around hills, was exactly the kind of question that historians still discuss today, and that he should write more about it. He was so pleased by this, that he went back to his journal immediately and wrote another page before dinner. It was on a Thursday evening at the end of the third week that Clara first heard Lord Harcourt's voice clearly and at length. She was passing through the upper corridor toward the schoolroom, carrying a candle and 2 books she had borrowed from the library, when she heard him in the room below, the study, whose windows were apparently open onto the garden, speaking to someone on the telephone. The telephone was relatively new to the house, she had gathered, and he used it rarely and with the particular focused energy of a man who did not like to repeat himself. She could not make out the specific words, but she could hear the tone. It was commanding without being unkind, direct without being cold. There was a precision to the way he spoke that she noticed in the same way she noticed it in written texts, as a quality, apart from its content. The way a sentence was built told you something about how a mind was built. She did not stop walking. She carried her books to the schoolroom, set them on the desk, and sat down to plan the next week's lessons by candlelight. But somewhere in the background of her attention, the tone of that voice stayed, like a musical note struck in an otherwise quiet room. She would not have been able to explain why she noticed it. She did not try to. She simply made a note in the margin of her lesson plan about the following Tuesday's history reading, closed the notebook, and went to bed. The 4th week arrived, with the kind of mild, golden weather that England produces rarely enough that everyone stops what they are doing and acknowledges it. The kitchen garden was vivid, with the first green things pushing through the earth. Mrs. Garland cut flowers and put them in every room, a sign of personal pleasure disguised as household duty. Even Mr. Holt, the butler, appeared slightly less neutral than usual when the afternoon sun came through the entrance hall windows. The children were allowed outside after their morning lessons, and Clara went with them. She brought books, as she always did, and sat on a bench at the edge of the kitchen garden, while Eloise and George did the things children do in open spaces when adults are not directing them. Ran, argued about something, resolved the argument, found a beetle, argued about the beetle, lost the beetle, found a different beetle, were disappointed that it was not the same beetle. Clara read, but she also watched, the way good teachers always watch, not to intervene but to understand. She could see the particular way Eloise led her brother, not by commanding, but by being interested in things first, drawing him in by her own engagement. She could see the way George's mind worked differently from Eloise's. Where his sister went deep into one thing, he moved quickly across many things, linking them, collecting, restless with curiosity. She was thinking about how to design a lesson that would satisfy both of them at the same time, when she looked up and found Lord Harcourt standing on the terrace above the garden, looking down. He was not looking at her, he was looking at the children. His expression was difficult to read from the distance, not cold, but contained, like someone watching something through glass. After perhaps a minute, he turned his head slightly, and his eyes passed over the garden, and briefly across the bench where Clara sat. There was no reaction. His gaze continued its sweep of the grounds, and then he went back inside. Clara returned to her book. But she had noticed something in that brief downward glance, not at her specifically, at the scene as a whole. There had been something in his face, in that one unguarded moment, that she had seen before. In her father's face, sometimes, when he came home from somewhere difficult and found her at the kitchen table with a book and a candle, and the relief of it was real, before he remembered that he was supposed to seem untroubled. It was not happiness. It was something quieter. The specific look of a person who is glad that something good is happening, even if they cannot join it. She filed it away without analyzing it. It was not her place to analyze. She had a job to do. The job was good. She would keep doing it. Eloise came running back from the far end of the garden, slightly out of breath, with something cupped in her hands. "I found a moth," she said. "It's alive. Can we study it?" "Yes," Clara said. "But first, tell me what you notice about it, before I tell you anything." Eloise opened her hands slightly, and they both looked down at the small, still creature resting in her palm. And for the next 20 minutes, under the open sky of a good April afternoon, the lesson happened. Not because it was scheduled, not because it was written in anyone's plan, but because a curious girl had picked something up off the ground, and a teacher had said, "Tell me what you see." This was the real work. Not the books, though the books mattered. Not the maps and the French sentences and the journal about old civilizations. All of those were doorways. The real work was this: learning to look at the world with the full attention of someone who believes it is worth looking at. Clara believed this with her whole life. She always had. And in the two children in front of her, she could see the same belief beginning to grow, quietly, the way things grow in April. Not with any announcement, but with the full and serious intention of becoming something. The moth, after a moment, opened its wings once and flew away. George, who had arrived late to the scene and missed most of it, looked at his empty-handed sister and said, "Where did it go?" "Somewhere else," Eloise said. "Was it interesting?" "Very," she said. He looked disappointed. "I'll find you another one," Eloise said, already turning back toward the garden, with the focused look of someone who has a task. Clara watched them both go, and the smile that crossed her face was the kind that does not require an audience. It simply came, and was real, and belonged to no one but the quiet afternoon and her own glad heart. There are moments in a life that seem ordinary while they are happening, and only later, sometimes years later, reveal themselves to have been the moment when everything turned. The dinner party at Ashmont Hall was not one of those moments. When it came, it was unmistakably what it was. No one who was in that drawing room that evening would later need to look back and decide what had happened. They knew, in the moment, that they were watching something, even if none of them could have predicted, in the seconds before it occurred, what it would be. Lord Harcourt had been hosting dinners at Ashmont Hall for as long as anyone in the household could remember. They were events of a particular kind, formal, polished, expensive, without being excessive, attended by the kind of people who knew exactly what to wear, and how to address each other, and who would be seated where, without needing to ask. Mrs. Doyle managed the preparations with the efficiency of a military operation. Mr. Holt oversaw the service with the same expression he wore at all times, which was to say, no particular expression at all, but a quality of total readiness. This particular dinner, in the last week of April, was for 12 guests. They included Viscount Gerald Pemberton, a man of 50, with excellent manners, and a personal fortune that had never been discussed in polite company, because there was no need to discuss what everyone already knew. There was also Sir Arthur Bellingham, and his wife, Lady Bellingham, who was widely regarded as one of the sharper minds in their social circle, and who had the habit of asking questions that seemed casual, and were not. There were 2 members of Parliament, a retired judge, a woman who had recently returned from abroad and whose conversation everyone found extremely good, and Monsieur Henri Delacroix, a French diplomat attached to the Paris embassy, who was visiting London on a matter of trade agreements, and had been invited at the last moment because Lord Harcourt valued his company, and found that a dinner with only English guests sometimes lacked a certain quality of argument. There was also a German guest, a man named Friedrich Brandt, a scholar and occasional advisor to trade delegations, who spoke little English, and found English social events bewildering in ways he was too polite to say directly, but that showed plainly in the slight delay before each of his replies, the delay of a man translating in real time. The dinner was scheduled for 7:30. At 6:30, the children were to be brought down to greet the early guests, a tradition Lord Harcourt maintained because he believed his children should know how to enter a room and speak to adults, and because the guests generally enjoyed it. It was a 5-minute event. The children came in, were introduced, said something polite, and then Clara took them back upstairs to bed. Clara had prepared Eloise and George for this. She had told them simply to speak clearly, look at the person they were speaking to, and if they did not know what to say, to ask the person a question about themselves. People, she told them, almost always enjoy being asked about themselves, and it will carry you through any silence. George had asked what to do if the person was boring. Clara had said, ask them another question. George had seemed uncertain about this strategy. Eloise had said that she would handle it if things went wrong, and George had accepted this with the confidence of someone who has learned that his sister's plans usually work. They went downstairs at exactly 6:30. Clara followed 2 steps behind, in the gray wool dress she wore every day, carrying nothing. The drawing room at Ashmont Hall was everything the schoolroom was not. It was a large room with high ceilings and deep green walls hung with paintings, lit that evening with candles and the warm orange light of a substantial fire. The guests stood in small clusters, glasses in hand, the particular music of a good dinner party warming up around them, the overlapping voices, the sound of something amusing being said, the soft ring of glass against glass. The women wore jewels. The men wore expressions of comfortable authority. Lord Harcourt was at the far end of the room near the fireplace, speaking to Viscount Pemberton. He was dressed impeccably, as always, and he turned when the children entered, and something in his face shifted very slightly, not softening exactly, but opening, the way a room opens when a window is raised. He moved toward them. Eloise greeted him in the way she had been taught, a small curtsy, composed, meeting his eyes. "Good evening, father." "Good evening, Eloise," he said. Then he looked at George, who was making a good effort at standing still, and mostly succeeding. "George." "Good evening, father," George said. Lord Harcourt led them through the room, introducing them to the guests one by one. Clara stood near the doorway. This was her position, present enough to step in, if needed, far enough back to be unobtrusive. She was furniture. She had understood this from the beginning, and did not object to it. It was simply the shape of the evening. Monsieur Delacroix was warm with the children. He made a small joke in heavily accented English that made George laugh, which was an achievement. Lady Bellingham told Eloise that she had excellent posture, which Eloise received with a grace that Clara had coached her in. A simple thank you, directly delivered, no more. Then came the moment when everything shifted. Lord Harcourt had turned slightly to speak to Monsieur Delacroix, and in turning, he found himself looking past the diplomat, toward the doorway where Clara stood. He registered her in that particular way that people register furniture, as an element of the room, present, accounted for, not quite a person in the moment of registration. Monsieur Delacroix followed his host's glance, and his expression shifted, not unkindly, but with the specific social calculation of a man considering whether to acknowledge someone standing at the edge of a scene. Lord Harcourt said something to Delacroix. He said it in French. He said it quietly but not silently. There was no particular effort at concealment, just the ease of a man who says what he is thinking to another man who speaks the same language, confident that the audience around him would not understand. What he said, translated, was this: "The little governess looks rather like someone who has arrived at the wrong address and is too polite to say so." He was smiling when he said it, not with cruelty. The way men smile at small observations that are not meant to wound, and do not consider whether they do. Monsieur Delacroix smiled back, the automatic response of a man in a social situation who has heard something mildly amusing. And then Clara spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not move from the doorway. She did not change her posture in any way. Her voice, when it came, was exactly as it always was. Steady, unhurried, simply present. She said, in French, so precise and naturally accented, that Monsieur Delacroix's expression changed immediately, that she found she knew her address quite well, and that she had found Ashmont Hall exactly as described. The room did not stop. The other conversations continued. But within the small circle of Delacroix, Lord Harcourt, and Clara, something had stopped entirely. Delacroix looked at her with an expression of complete recalibration, the look of a man who has been told that a painting is a reproduction, and has just realized it is not. Lord Harcourt's expression did not change, but the way he was holding himself changed, the way a man's bearing changes when the floor does something unexpected beneath him. Clara then turned, with the same composure she had carried into the room, to Monsieur Delacroix and addressed him. In Italian, she said it was a pleasure to meet him, and that she hoped his time in London had been productive. He replied in Italian, automatically, and then caught himself and laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised out of him. "You speak Italian also," he said, in French. "And German," she said, and turned to Friedrich Brandt, who had been standing slightly apart from the group, with the expression of a man who has stopped trying to follow the English around him, and was now simply observing. She addressed him directly in German, saying something that made him look up sharply, and then smile. The smile of a man who has been seen after an evening of invisibility. He replied at length, and she replied to his reply, and they were briefly in a conversation of their own that had nothing to do with anyone else in the room. The drawing room had not gone quiet, but within it, a new quality of attention had settled. The woman at the door was no longer furniture. Lord Harcourt said nothing. He stood very still. Lady Bellingham, from across the room, had been watching this unfold with the particular pleasure of a woman who enjoys seeing the unexpected happen, in a space where too much is expected. She said nothing either, but she set down her glass and gave the doorway a long, considering look. Eloise, standing at her father's side, looked up at Clara, with an expression that Clara would later remember as one of the purest she had ever seen on a child's face. It was not surprise. Eloise had known, with the instinct of a child who pays attention, that Clara contained more than anyone in this house had noticed. What was on Eloise's face was something closer to recognition, the particular satisfaction of being right about something that mattered. George, for his part, looked between Clara and his father with a furrowed forehead, working something out. Clara brought both children back to the door after another moment. She did it calmly, with a small touch on each shoulder indicating it was time. She said goodnight to the room in a tone that was exactly what it always was, clear, composed, belonging entirely to her. Then she took the children upstairs. In the hallway at the top of the stairs, Eloise said, "You spoke in 3 different languages." "Yes," Clara said. "Did he know you understood?" "He did not," Clara said. "Does it bother you?" Eloise asked. "That he said that?" Clara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It tells me something," she said finally. "It does not change anything." Eloise was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It changes something about him." Clara looked at her. The girl was 8 years old, and she had said something precise and true. "Perhaps," Clara said. She settled the children into bed, read to them briefly. George was asleep before the end of the page. Eloise stayed awake through 2 more pages than usual, and then closed her eyes with the determined expression of someone choosing to sleep, rather than falling into it. Clara set the book down, moved the candle back to the corridor, and stood for a moment in the dark. Below, the dinner party continued. She could hear the distant sound of it, voices, a brief burst of laughter, the soft percussion of a meal being served. 12 people in an expensive room, eating well, talking, and she was here, in the corridor outside 2 children's bedrooms, in a gray dress, with her hand still warm from the pages she had been holding. She was not angry. She had been asked too many times in her life whether a situation like this made her angry, and the truthful answer was more complicated than yes or no. There was something in it that was not pleasant, a recognition of how easily you could be spoken about, as though you were not there, by people who meant it simply as a comfortable habit of mind, rather than any particular cruelty. But there was also this. She had answered. She had answered in French and Italian and German, without raising her voice or losing her composure, and she had done it not as a performance, but as the simple truth of who she was, offered into a room that had not expected it. She did not know what would come next. She did not know what Lord Harcourt's thoughts were, as he sat at the head of his table, or whether the evening's small incident was already behind him, or still present in some corner of his attention. She walked back to her room. She took off her shoes and sat at the desk and opened the book she had been reading, a collection of French poetry, slim and worn, which had been her mother's before it was hers. She read for an hour. The words were easy and familiar, and the pleasure of them was uncomplicated. She had answered. That was enough. Whatever came next would come in its own time. Lord Edmund Harcourt sat at the head of his table and did not hear most of what was said for the next 40 minutes. This was unprecedented. He was, by every account including his own, an attentive host. He read people well, steered conversations with a light and practiced hand, and had never in his memory lost the thread of an evening. His dinners were known for their quality. Not just the food, not just the appointments, but the conversation, which he shaped the way a careful gardener shapes a garden, not controlling everything, but knowing where to intervene. Tonight the conversation continued without him. Viscount Pemberton made a very good point about trade, and Lady Bellingham disagreed with him, in a way that was more interesting than agreement would have been. Monsieur Delacroix, who should have been the most engaged person at the table given the trade discussion that was the official reason for his presence, was instead unusually thoughtful and distracted. He caught Lord Harcourt's eye once during the fish course and held it for just a moment, and the expression he wore was one of mild, wondering interest, like a man turning over an unexpected object, examining it from different sides. Lord Harcourt looked away first. The evening ended at a reasonable hour. He saw his guests to the door himself, as was correct, exchanging the final pleasantries that marked the end of an evening well enough spent. Monsieur Delacroix was the last to leave, and as he put on his coat he said, quietly and in French, that the governess was remarkable. Lord Harcourt said, "So I am beginning to understand." Delacroix smiled. Her French is better than mine, he said. Better than mine in terms of precision. She uses the subjunctive correctly in casual speech, which very few non-native speakers manage. Where did she learn? I don't know, Lord Harcourt said. Delacroix gave him a look that was impossible to fully interpret. It contained within it, somewhere, the impression that this ignorance was perhaps worth addressing. Then he said good night and walked out into the cool April air. Lord Harcourt stood at the open door for a moment after the last carriage had gone, then closed it and stood in the entrance hall. The house was quiet now. The staff had efficiently cleared the drawing room and the dining room, and only the faint smell of candle smoke and good food remained, thinning into the old cold stone smell of the house itself. He went to his study and sat at his desk. He was not, as a rule, the kind of man who sat with his thoughts for long periods without doing something practical. He was organized. He was efficient. He had inherited an estate that had been mismanaged in his father's last years of illness, and he had spent the better part of a decade restoring it to order, and the habit of efficiency had become part of who he was. When something needed to be thought about, he thought about it, and reached a conclusion, and acted on it. Tonight he sat at his desk for 45 minutes and did not do anything practical at all. He thought about what he had said in the drawing room. He turned it over, not looking for a way to excuse it, but examining it clearly, the way he would examine a bad decision in a business matter, finding the exact moment of failure and understanding what it had assumed. He had assumed she would not understand. That was the whole of it. He had not thought of Clara Voss as a person in possession of a particular history or education or capability. He had thought of her as a type, the modest governess, suitable for basic education of children, unremarkable in every particular. He had formed this opinion not through any evidence but through her appearance, her dress, her quietness, her place in the hierarchy of his household. He had built a complete picture of her from these details, and it had not occurred to him that the picture was a construction, not a portrait. He was, he recognized, a man who prided himself on accurate judgment. It was one of the things he was most certain of about himself, that he read situations and people with clarity, and he had, in this instance, been entirely and plainly wrong. This was uncomfortable. He sat with the discomfort, rather than moving past it. He knew almost nothing about Clara Voss. He knew she had been hired through the agency. He knew she came from Somerset. He knew she was the daughter of a clergyman. Beyond this, everything he had assumed about her had been built on a kind of social reasoning that he now recognized as both lazy and blind. She wore simple clothes. She came from a modest background. Therefore she was simple. It was the reasoning of a man who had never had to question his categories, because his categories had never before been asked to account for themselves. He pulled out the household file for the new staff and found her letter of application. He read it for the first time. It was one page, handwritten in a clear and exact hand, grammatically perfect, expressed with the kind of economy that said the writer knew how to use language and had not felt the need to perform. It mentioned her father's work in Europe, briefly, without elaboration. It mentioned her experience with children, also briefly. It did not mention languages at all. He read the letter twice and set it down. In the morning, he would write to the agency. He would also, and he decided this clearly, without drama, find some way to understand who he had actually hired. Not from curiosity about a novelty, but because it was plainly the right thing to know. But the thing that stayed with him, that was still there when he finally went to bed that night, later than usual, was not the languages, or the embarrassment, or even the specific sharpness of her French reply. It was something Eloise had done. He had seen it from the corner of his eye, in the moment after Clara had spoken. His daughter had looked at the woman at the doorway with an expression that he had only rarely seen on Eloise's face, the particular look of a child who has known something and been waiting for someone else to catch up, a look of recognition. His daughter had known who Clara was before tonight, had known, in whatever way a child knows things, that this woman was not what she appeared to everyone else to be. And he had not known. He had been in the same house as this person for 3 weeks, and he had not known. He lay in the dark for a while thinking about that, about the gap between what was in front of you and what you actually saw, about how much you could miss simply because you had already decided what you were looking at. It was not a comfortable set of thoughts for a man who prided himself on clarity, but he had long ago learned that uncomfortable thoughts were usually the ones worth having. He slept eventually. The next morning he wrote 3 letters. The first was to the agency that had placed Clara, asking for her full letter of reference from her previous employer and any additional history they held on file. The second was to a colleague, who had connections in the educational world in France. A casual note, not framed as a formal inquiry. The third he did not write immediately. He sat with a blank sheet of paper for several minutes, tapping his pen against the desk, and then put the paper away. That particular thing would need to be done differently. What came back over the next several days was not what he had expected, and he was not easily surprised. The first letter returned with a brief, somewhat confused response from the agency, explaining that Miss Voss's reference letters were unusually comprehensive, and that they had been surprised, at the time of placing her, to find someone with her background applying for a governess position, but that she had been clear about her preference, and there had been no reason to question it. The reference letters, 2 of them, included, were from a professor of classical languages at a college in Edinburgh, and from a French intellectual in Paris, who described her written French as superior to that of most educated Frenchmen, and her Italian and German as entirely fluent. Lord Harcourt read these letters twice. Then he set them on his desk and looked at the wall for a moment. She had a reference from a professor of classical languages. She had a reference from a French intellectual in Paris, and she was teaching his children their times tables and the history of England in a schoolroom above the East Wing. He wrote to his colleague in France. The response came back within a week, and it confirmed what the letters had suggested. Her father, Reverend Voss, had been a known figure in certain European intellectual circles, a man who had moved across the continent and left an impression. His daughter had apparently accompanied him and absorbed everything along the way. Lord Harcourt put the letter down. He sat with this information, not organizing it, not planning what to do with it, but simply sitting with the image it created. A girl, moving across Europe, France, Germany, Italy. A father who took ideas seriously, and who had evidently passed this on. Languages absorbed in the way you absorb them when you actually live among the people who speak them, not from books in a classroom. And then England, a clergyman's life in Somerset. A father who died. The tense of the application letter had suggested this. A daughter left, with 5 languages, and a reference from a Paris intellectual, and no category that the English world of 1887 quite knew what to do with. He understood now why she had applied for a governess position. It was not ambition, or the lack of it. It was simply that there were very few positions available to a woman of her education and her class. She could not teach at a university. She could not work as a translator, except in very specific circumstances. She had applied for the role that was available to her. He understood this, and the understanding sat in him with a particular weight that he could not quite name. That Thursday, he made a decision. He told Mr. Holt to let Miss Voss know that she had unrestricted access to the library at any hour. Not as a formal announcement. Simply as a fact of the household's operations that she should be aware of. Mr. Holt delivered this message with the same expression he delivered all messages, and later reported that Miss Voss had thanked him and gone directly to the library and spent 2 hours in it, returning to the schoolroom with 6 books under her arm. Lord Harcourt heard this report and said nothing. But that afternoon, for the first time, he walked past the schoolroom door while the lesson was in session and stopped for a moment. He did not open the door. He stood outside it and listened. He could hear Clara's voice. She was reading something, French, he recognized, and then pausing and asking a question, and Eloise answered in French, haltingly but with genuine effort, and Clara's response was immediate and warm, and contained within it the specific energy of someone who finds great pleasure in the progress of another person. He heard George ask something, a question about whether ancient people had spoken French, and he heard Clara explain, with patience and a trace of humor, that the great empire had spoken Latin, and that French had grown from Latin over many centuries, and that George was in fact already learning Latin's grandchild. There was a small silence. Then George said, "So Latin is Old French?" "In a way," Clara said, "more like French is young Latin." Another small silence. Then George said with great satisfaction, "That's good." Lord Harcourt stood outside the door for another minute. Then he walked away. He did not know yet what he wanted to do with all of this. He knew only that something in the picture of his household had changed, and that the change was uncomfortable in the way that real things are uncomfortable. Not painfully, but solidly. Real. He had said something careless in a drawing room. A woman had answered him in 3 languages. And now, for the first time in 3 weeks, he was beginning to understand who had been in his house all along. The household noticed before it said anything. This was the way of things at Ashmont Hall. Changes moved through the staff the way changes always moved through households with a strong internal culture, in sidelong glances and pauses slightly longer than necessary, and sentences not quite finished before a topic changed. No one said directly that things were different with the governess, but everyone knew. The first visible sign was the library. Before, the housemaids had understood that Miss Voss occasionally borrowed from the foreign language section. Agnes had reported it, Mrs. Doyle had noted it, and it had sat in the household's awareness as a mildly peculiar fact. After Lord Harcourt sent his message through Mr. Holt about unrestricted access, the relationship between Clara and the library shifted publicly. She was seen there regularly. She was seen there at hours that were neither suspicious nor restricted. Mid-morning, an evening hour, the early afternoon on days when the children's lessons were done. She carried books out and brought them back. She made no particular show of this, but it was seen, and the fact that it had been sanctioned, directly, by Lord Harcourt, that was noted. Agnes began to revise her opinion of Clara Voss, though she would not have described it that way. She simply found, over the following days, that she stopped including Miss Voss in the category of people who were probably not going to last long at Ashmont Hall, and started including her in a different and less defined category, that she thought of loosely as part of the furniture, which in Agnes's mind was a high compliment, since furniture was permanent. Mrs. Garland had always liked Clara, for the reasons she liked most people. Clara cleaned her plate and caused no inconvenience, and did not significantly revise her opinion in either direction. She did, however, start leaving an extra serving of bread at the side table whenever she knew Clara had come in from a late evening with the library. She would not have said this was a gesture of respect. She would have said she just happened to make more bread on those days. Mr. Holt observed everything and said nothing, which was his standard practice. But he updated, internally and without drama, his considered opinion of each member of the household staff. The entry for Miss Voss, which had previously read something like adequate, quiet, unlikely to cause trouble, was amended to something considerably more substantial, though he kept the amendment entirely to himself. Mrs. Doyle was the most complicated case. She was a woman who kept things in careful order, and an important part of that order was knowing what each person in the household was, their category, their weight, their proper place in the arrangement of things. Clara had slipped her category in a way that was difficult to accommodate, without acknowledging that the original category had been wrong, and Mrs. Doyle was not easily inclined to acknowledge that she had been wrong. She chose instead to treat what had happened in the drawing room as an interesting anomaly, a surprising detail about an otherwise unremarkable person, and to hold this position with the determination of a woman who has been managing households for 22 years, and does not intend to be troubled by a governess who happened to speak French. But there were cracks in this position. She found them during the 4th week, when Eloise, during a chance encounter in the upper corridor, said good morning to her in French. Not to show off, simply because she had been speaking French with Clara an hour earlier, and was still partly living in it, the way you sometimes walk out of a dream and carry its texture with you for an hour. She said bonjour, and then switched immediately to English, and continued on her way. Mrs. Doyle stood in the corridor for a moment after Eloise had passed. The girl was 8 years old. She had said a French word with the ease of someone who was beginning to have it in her body, rather than just her memory. 3 weeks ago, Eloise had known no French at all. Mrs. Doyle went about her duties. That evening she said nothing to anyone. But something had moved in her, something small but real, and she was honest enough within herself to recognize what it was. It was not admiration, quite. It was something less comfortable. It was the beginning of having to revise. Clara knew none of the specific details of these internal adjustments. She was not unaware that the household's temperature toward her had changed. She was an observant person, and had spent her life reading rooms the way other people read pages, but she did not know the particulars. She continued her work in the same way she had always done it, steadily, without making noise, with complete attention to the task in front of her. The task, in that 4th week, was expanding. Eloise's French was progressing faster than Clara had expected. She had a gift for it that was evident not in her speed of memorization, She was not particularly fast at memorizing, but in the quality of her instinct. She seemed to feel where words belonged, in a sentence, before she knew why. And when she got something wrong, she was usually wrong in a way that was interesting, reaching for the French logic in a moment when it diverged from the English, making an error that showed she was thinking in the language rather than translating into it. Clara had seen this before, in students who were going to be genuinely fluent. Not all of them. Most students learned a language the way you learn a town, by following the main roads until you know the route by heart. The rare ones learned it the way you learn a neighborhood, by going slightly the wrong way occasionally and discovering something unexpected and building the map from inside rather than outside. Eloise was doing the second thing. George, meanwhile, had completed his first journal and started a new one. The new journal was about rivers. He had decided that rivers were more interesting than almost everything else and was pursuing this hypothesis with the intensity of a small scientist. He had asked Clara to teach him the names of the great rivers of Europe, and she had, and he had written them all down and tried to draw their paths from memory on a blank sheet of paper, getting some right and some dramatically wrong, and being corrected without embarrassment, because Clara had made it clear, early on, that being corrected was just the next step in learning, and was not a judgment. He had also asked her to tell him which rivers the great ancient builders had used, and which ones they had named, and whether the Thames had an old name. She had told him it had several names over the centuries, including one from before the great empire arrived, and he had written this down with the expression of someone who has just discovered that history is not a straight line, but a very complicated set of layers, each one underneath the next. "How do you know where one layer ends and another begins?" he asked. "Sometimes you don't," Clara said. "That's what makes history interesting. You're always finding something older underneath the thing you thought was oldest." George had looked at her steadily. "Like digging," he said. "Exactly like digging," she agreed. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his map of rivers. It was in the middle of the 4th week that Lord Harcourt came to the schoolroom. He did not send notice. He simply appeared at the door at 10:30 in the morning, knocked, which the previous lord of the house had apparently never done, based on Mrs. Doyle's visible surprise when Clara mentioned it later, and opened the door. Clara stood immediately. The children looked up. "Please don't stop on my account," he said. His voice in the schoolroom was different from his voice she had heard through the study window, or in the brief corridor encounters. It was the same voice, the same directness, the same economy, but in this small room, it had a different quality, more careful. "Good morning, Father," Eloise said, and there was a brightness in her voice that was not forced. "Good morning, Eloise." "George." He looked at them both. "I am told you are learning French." "Yes," Eloise said. "Would you like to hear?" He looked at his daughter for a moment. Something moved in his expression, the same thing Clara had noticed on the terrace, the thing that looked like gladness from a distance. "If you'd like to show me," he said. Eloise said 3 sentences in French. Her accent was not perfect. It was clearly that of an English child beginning her way into another language, but the sentences were grammatically correct, and her confidence in them was real. When she finished, she looked at her father. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's very good." "Miss Voss says I'm thinking in it," Eloise said, "not just translating." He looked at Clara. It was a direct look, not the glancing registration of their corridor encounters, but an actual look at her as a person in the room. "Is that how you teach it?" he asked. "It's how I try to teach it," Clara said. "The goal is for the language to be inside you, not beside you." There was a pause. He was looking at her in a way that was different from anything that had happened before in this house, and Clara recognized what it was. He was actually seeing her, not the category, not the position, her. "Carry on," he said, and went to the door. Then he paused. "The library," he said, not turning around. "If there is anything in it that would be useful to the children's education, please make use of it." "Thank you," Clara said. "I already have." The smallest possible silence. Then he left, and the door closed behind him. Eloise looked at Clara. Clara looked at Eloise. George looked at both of them, and then looked back at his map of rivers. "He never came to the schoolroom before," Eloise said. "I know," Clara said. "He stayed for almost 5 minutes," Eloise said. "Did you count?" Clara asked. "Yes," Eloise said. and returned to her French lesson without further comment, but with an expression that was careful and pleased, and trying not to be too openly pleased about something that clearly pleased her very much. Clara returned to the lesson, but she was aware, in some quiet part of her, that the shape of things at Ashmont Hall had changed. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but the way a room changes when a window is opened, the temperature the same, but the air different, moving. She had answered him in a drawing room. He had heard the answer. And now, somehow, the house was different. She did not know what she expected from that difference. She had not come here with expectations of any particular kind. She had come here to do good work, and she was doing good work, and the work was its own reason. But she was human, and being human meant that being seen, actually seen, as the specific and particular person you are, rather than the category you have been assigned, meant something. It meant something even when you had told yourself it did not need to. She taught the rest of the morning with full attention. She always did, but for a brief moment, during the hour when Eloise recited her French sentences, and George marked rivers on his map, and the spring light came through the schoolroom window at a long and golden angle, she allowed herself to feel it. The particular lightness of being known, of having your depth acknowledged by someone who had looked past you for weeks, and then finally, clearly, looked. It was not triumph. She was not a person who reached for triumph. It was quieter than that. The satisfaction of a true thing, being seen as true. Outside the window, the grounds of Ashmont Hall were bright and green and unhurried. The sky was the particular blue that arrives in England sometimes in late April, and stays just long enough that you remember why you love the country before the gray comes back. The children bent over their work. Clara watched them and thought, this is what it is to teach someone, not to put knowledge into an empty vessel, to recognize the shape of what is already there, and help it grow toward the light. She had a great deal more work ahead of her, all three of them, student and teacher alike. But they had begun. They had truly, now, begun. The letter from Edinburgh arrived on a Tuesday. Lord Harcourt recognized the handwriting on the envelope before he opened it, because he had seen a copy of the same hand in the reference letter that had come from the agency. Professor Duncan Hartley, Department of Classical Languages, University of Edinburgh. The professor had not been invited to write. Lord Harcourt had written to him first. A careful and brief inquiry, framed as a general question about the standards of language education in governess positions, and whether the professor had any recent knowledge of candidates he had recommended to such positions. It had been a roundabout way of asking about Clara. He had known it was roundabout when he wrote it. He had written it that way anyway. Hartley's response was not roundabout at all. I presume, it began, that you are writing about Clara Voss, since she is the only person I have recommended to a governess agency in the last several years, and since the phrasing of your letter suggests you are a man who already knows the answer to the question he is asking, and wishes to confirm it, I am happy to confirm it. Lord Harcourt read this opening twice. Then he continued. Miss Voss came to my attention through a colleague in Paris, who had encountered her father's work, and mentioned that the daughter was in Edinburgh, and was tutoring the children of several families, while attempting to find a more permanent position. I invited her to discuss a potential research role. We had a project on late Roman correspondence that needed someone with facility in both Latin and French. She came to the meeting with a precision that I would describe, without any exaggeration, as remarkable. Her Latin was not merely competent, but genuinely good. Not the Latin of someone who has studied it formally, but the Latin of someone who has read it for pleasure for years, which produces a different quality of understanding. Her French, as you may know by now, is effectively native. Her German and Italian are fluent. She also reads ancient Greek, though she modestly described her Greek as still uncertain, which in her terms means it would exceed the reading ability of most classically trained men of my acquaintance. Lord Harcourt set the letter down. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window and looked at the drive for a moment. Then he came back and continued reading. She did not take the research role, not because she was unqualified, but because the position was short-term and paid badly, and she needed stability. She took instead the governess work, which she approached with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. I thought this a significant waste of a first-class mind. I still think so. I am aware that the options available to women of her intelligence and her class are not what they should be, and I have made my views on this subject known in various quarters to very little practical effect. She has a better understanding of what is possible than I do, and she has chosen what is possible with more grace than I would have managed." The letter continued for another paragraph, in which Hartley mentioned 2 specific scholarly articles that had recently been published in French journals, articles on Roman correspondence and on the movement of Latin into later languages, and noted that Clara had, without acknowledgement or payment, provided substantial translation and editorial assistance on both. She had not sought credit. The authors had included a line of thanks in a footnote, which Hartley found inadequate, but which Clara had considered perfectly sufficient. Lord Harcourt read the letter a 3rd time. He then sat for a long time at his desk, doing nothing. This was unusual for him. He was not a man who sat doing nothing. But the information in the letter, combined with the letters from the agency, the response from Paris, and the specific memory of that drawing-room moment, which had not left him, had produced in him a state that he could only describe, internally, and somewhat uncomfortably, as having to reconsider something fundamental. He had hired a woman who had provided translation and research assistance to publishing scholars, who had a reference from a professor of classical languages, whose French was native in quality, who read Latin for pleasure and ancient Greek for the challenge of it. And he had stood in his own drawing room and spoken about her in French, to her face, because he had been certain she would not understand. He was a man who, when he found a mistake in his management of the estate, did not repeat it. He adjusted. He updated his understanding. He moved forward. He did not spend extended time in the discomfort of having been wrong, because extended time in that discomfort was unproductive, and he was a practical person. But this was different from an error in estate management. This was an error in seeing, in the most basic act of recognizing another person. He filed the letter with the others in the household box. Then he took them all out again and read them once more in sequence. Agency reference, Hartley's letter, the Paris response, and at the beginning, Clara's own single-page application, which said so little but now, reading it again, said everything to someone reading it correctly. She had not hidden anything. She had simply given the minimum required information in the most efficient language possible, and he had read it with the attention he typically gave to household staffing applications, which was to say very little, and he had missed all of it. He put the papers away. That evening, he did something he had not done since before his wife had died. He went to the children's rooms, not at the prescribed greeting hour, but late, past 8 o'clock, when the children were in bed. He knocked on Eloise's door and opened it. She was not asleep. She was reading by candlelight, which he suspected she often did, and which he had not enforced against, believing that a child who read voluntarily was doing something worth protecting. She looked up when he came in with the expression of a child who is not quite sure whether she is in trouble. He sat in the chair beside her bed. "What are you reading?" he asked. She held it up. It was the mythology book. Clara's mythology book, he realized. The one with the worn spine that he had seen in the library once without knowing whose it was. "Miss Voss lent it to you?" he asked. "She let me borrow it," Eloise said. "She reads it every year." "Why every year?" Eloise considered this. "She says the stories mean different things to you at different ages. She says she was reading it when she was 6, and it meant one thing, and when she was 12 it meant something else, and when her father died, she read it again, and it meant something completely different." He looked at the book. "Do you understand it?" "Some of it," Eloise said. "The parts I don't understand, yet I mark with a little pencil line so I can come back to them." He looked at his daughter. She was 8 years old. She was marking passages she did not yet understand, so she could return to them. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "Miss Voss," she said simply. He nodded. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. He looked at the book, and then at Eloise, and then at the candle on the bedside table. "Do you like her?" he asked. He was not entirely sure why he asked it. Eloise looked at him with the directness that was very particular to her. "Yes," she said. "She's the best teacher I've ever had. Not because she knows a lot of things, though she does, but because she thinks I'm interesting." He was quiet for a moment. "You are interesting," he said. "I know," Eloise said, "but people don't usually think so." He did not have an answer to this. He was aware that he had not, himself, thought about whether his daughter was interesting. He had thought about whether she was healthy, whether she was being properly educated, whether she was happy in the general sense. He had not thought about whether she was interesting. It had not occurred to him as a category. "I should let you sleep," he said. "You can stay," she said, "if you want to." He stayed for another quarter hour. He did not say much. She read a few more pages, and then set the book aside, and closed her eyes. He blew out the candle, and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the house breathe, before he went quietly out. In the corridor, he stood still for a moment. At the far end of the east wing, there was a light under Clara's door. A candle, almost certainly, kept late. She was reading. He stood in the corridor for a long moment, aware of the light. Then he went downstairs to his study. He had things to think about. He thought about them for a long time. There was a particular afternoon in early July. The kind of afternoon that sits perfectly inside summer, not too bright, the shadows long and golden. When Lord Harcourt came to the schoolroom door, knocked, and asked whether the children might be spared for an hour, to see a demonstration that Edward the groundskeeper was planning to give, about the estate's orchards. Clara looked at the children. Eloise was mid-sentence in a French composition. George was doing arithmetic without complaint, which was an unusual state that Clara had no desire to interrupt. But she had also learned, over the months, that Lord Harcourt's requests of the children were not frequent, and that when they came, they were worth taking. "We can continue later," she told them. George was off his chair before she finished the sentence. Eloise set her pen down with more decorum, but was through the door almost as fast. Clara began tidying the lesson materials on the desk. She assumed she was not included in the invitation. She had not been addressed directly. "Miss Voss," Lord Harcourt said from the doorway. She looked up. "If you'd like to come," he said. She put the pen in its place. "Thank you," she said. They went out to the orchards, the four of them, plus Edward, who led them through the organized rows of old fruit trees, and explained the stages of the summer, what was ripening, what had already been harvested, what required attention in the coming weeks. He spoke about the trees the way he spoke about the ground in the fields, with the knowledge of someone who has learned from long attention, rather than from books, which was its own kind of intelligence, and which Clara respected in the same way she respected any precise knowledge of a thing. George asked questions. Of course he did. He wanted to know how old the oldest tree was, and whether old trees made better fruit. Edward answered that the oldest tree was estimated at about 90 years, and that older trees often produced less fruit, but what they produced was sometimes better. And George wrote this in his notebook, under a new heading he had just created: Things that get better with age. Eloise found a fallen apple, early, small, probably not quite ripe, and asked whether she could have it. Edward said she could. She bit into it, made a face, and gave the other half to George, who ate it without any face at all. Lord Harcourt walked slightly apart from the group, which Clara noticed, not in a way that suggested withdrawal, but in a way that suggested comfort. A man in his own space, with his own people, not performing anything for anyone. He spoke to Edward occasionally. He watched the children with the look she had first noticed from the terrace, the contained gladness. At one point he came to walk beside Clara at the edge of the orchard path. They walked in silence for a moment. The orchard was warm and smelled of green things and old wood. "How long have you been here?" he asked. She knew he meant at Ashmont Hall. "Almost 3 months," she said. He nodded. "The children have changed," he said. "They've been allowed to," she said. He looked at her. She met his eyes. There was, between them, a quality of directness now that had built over months. Not intimacy, but honest proximity. The relationship that forms between two people who have, without planning it, been consistently truthful with each other. "Eloise speaks of you," he said, "often." "She speaks of you also," Clara said. "She worries that you work too much." A pause. He appeared to take this seriously. "Does she?" "She tells me things," Clara said. "I don't repeat them as a rule, but that one she has said, clearly enough, that I think she would want you to know it." He was quiet for a moment. In the distance, George had asked Edward something that had produced a long and detailed answer. Eloise was standing near the oldest tree, touching the bark with one hand in that way she had of making contact with old things. "She is right," he said. Clara said nothing. "I work because it fills the space," he said. It was a very simple thing to say, and it was clearly true, and she recognized that it had been said to her in the same spirit that he had offered the acknowledgement in the sitting room, not as something owed, but as something real, offered to someone who would take it seriously. "That is understandable," she said. "It is not sufficient," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at Eloise, still at the old tree. His face had the look of someone who has just found the right words for something he has been unable to say for a long time. "No," Clara agreed. "Not sufficient." They walked on. The afternoon continued. Edward finished his tour of the orchard and suggested they might return in September, when the main harvest was happening, and George said he would count the days, which he probably meant literally. Eloise said goodbye to the oldest tree in French, quietly, which she perhaps did not realize anyone heard. Clara heard it. She said nothing about it. They walked back toward the house in the long golden light, the shadow of Ashmont Hall stretching toward them across the lawn. The four of them and Edward, close enough to be a group, spread enough to each be themselves. Clara walked and felt the summer and thought of her father, who had believed that the quality of a day was not measured by its events, but by how fully present you were in it. She was fully present. The children were beside her, exactly as they should be. The work was good. The change she could not yet fully name was continuing its slow and serious work around her. That was enough. More than enough. The field trip to the far end of the estate on a Saturday morning in early June was, by any reasonable measure, one of the better days that Ashmont Hall had produced in some time. The weather cooperated in the particular way that early June weather sometimes cooperates in England. Genuinely warm, blue-skied, with a breeze that had warmth in it rather than the previous month's edge. Mr. Holt had arranged for Edward the groundskeeper to accompany them and identify the area where the old stones were visible. Edward was a large, quiet man who knew the estate's land with the precision of someone who had walked every inch of it across 30 years, and he led them through the back of the grounds and across a field that sloped gently downward toward a line of old trees. George walked very fast, ahead of everyone, which Clara allowed because she could see him from a constant distance, and the path was clear. Eloise walked beside Clara and asked, as they crossed the field, whether the people of the ancient empire had worn warm clothes. "Yes," Clara said. "Though not always the right kind for England." "Were they cold?" "Probably. They wrote about it. Soldiers stationed in Britain complained about the rain and the cold in letters home, just as soldiers anywhere complain about the weather they did not expect." Eloise considered this. "So they had people they wrote letters to?" "Yes, parents, sisters, friends. Some of their letters still exist." "We have some of them?" Eloise stopped walking. The idea had clearly struck her with a particular force. "In various collections," Clara said. "Professor Hartley in Edinburgh works on them." "People wrote letters 2,000 years ago," Eloise said slowly, "and we can still read them." "Yes." The girl looked at the field around them, then looked down at the ground under her feet. "So the letters lasted longer than the people." "Words usually do," Clara said. Eloise started walking again, and she was quieter for the next few minutes, in the way she was quiet when something was settling into place inside her. Not a sad quiet, but a thinking one. George, ahead of them, had reached the old trees and was now standing next to Edward, who was pointing at something on the ground. By the time Clara and Eloise reached them, George had already found what they had come to see, a line of stones, dark with old age and partly sunk into the soil, running at a right angle to the field's edge. Not dramatic, not immediately obvious unless you knew what you were looking at. But George knew, from his reading and from Clara's descriptions, what this pattern meant, and he was standing over it with the expression of someone encountering something they believed in. "It's a wall," he said. He did not phrase this as a question. "Foundation of one," Edward confirmed. He was a man of few words, but they were accurate. "Been here as long as anyone knew. Stones are too old to be anything recent." George crouched down and looked at the stones very carefully. He did not touch them. He looked. "They set them by hand," he said. "Each one." "Yes," Clara said. "People did this." He looked up at her. "People exactly like us." She crouched next to him. "In some ways," she said, "and in other ways, very different. But yes. People who were afraid of things, and wanted things, and had people they loved and work they were proud of. People who complained about the cold, and wrote letters home." George looked at the stones. He was 6 years old. He was very still, which was unusual for him. Clara let him be still. After several minutes he stood up. He opened his small notebook, which he had brought. She had not needed to remind him, and wrote something. She did not read over his shoulder. She straightened up and stood beside him while he wrote, watching the field and the trees and the old light that came through the tree line, at a low angle across the grass. Eloise was a few steps away, examining the stones from another angle. She had picked up a small piece of loose flint from near the edge of the line and was turning it over in her hand. She said, quietly, "Someone touched this." "Possibly," Clara said. "Or it's just a piece of old flint." "But possibly." "Yes." Eloise closed her hand around it. She put it in her pocket. Clara noted this and said nothing about it. They stayed in the field for about an hour. Edward answered George's questions about the ground and the stones and the rest of the estate, with the patience of a man who genuinely did not mind questions. George asked 11 questions. Edward answered all of them accurately and without talking down to the boy, which made Clara like the man considerably. On the way back across the field, George walked beside Clara and said, "I want to know what happened to them, the people who built the wall. Some of them went back to other parts of the empire. Some of them stayed. Some married into local families. Over time, the distinction became less clear. So they mixed," he said. "Yes." He walked for a moment. "That's good," he said. "I think that's better than everyone staying separate." She looked at him. He said things, sometimes, that reached past the obvious in ways that surprised her. "Why do you think so?" she asked, genuinely. He thought about it. "Because, if you only ever talk to people who already know the same things you know, you stop finding out new things." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is a very good thought, George." "Miss Voss says that's a very good thought," he told Eloise immediately. Eloise rolled her eyes. "I heard her." "I wanted to make sure." "I heard her," Eloise said again. Clara walked between them, not smiling but close to it, through the long summer field with the old stones behind them, and Ashmont Hall visible in the distance, its pale stone and tall windows catching the afternoon light, and thought that on balance, this was an excellent day. When they returned to the house, Lord Harcourt was in the entrance hall dealing with some estate business, and happened to be present when they came in. Slightly grass-stained, all three of them, Clara included, because she had at one point crouched quite near the stones, and not been particularly careful. George went directly to his father with the notebook open. "We found ancient stones," he said. His father looked at the notebook. He looked at it with attention, not with the distracted half-attention of a busy man managing a child. He read what was on the page. "You drew it," he said. "From memory," George said, after. "Miss Voss says you should try to draw what you remember, rather than while you're there. Because if you draw while you're there, you spend all the time drawing, and not looking." Lord Harcourt looked at Clara briefly over his son's head. She met his eyes, said nothing. He looked back at the notebook. "It's very accurate," he said to George. "Edward said the stones go under the field," George said. "They might go all the way to the tree line, maybe further." "That's possible," his father said. "Could we do more looking, properly?" Lord Harcourt was quiet for a moment. With the right help, it would need to be done carefully. George's face went through several expressions very quickly. He settled on, "Yes." "I'll look into it," his father said. George closed the notebook with the deliberate satisfaction of someone who has accomplished something and knows it. He went upstairs. Eloise, who had been watching this exchange from a step behind, gave her father a look and then followed her brother. Lord Harcourt watched them go. Then he looked at Clara. "How was it?" he asked. Simple question, not formal. "Very good," she said. He had been waiting for it all week. He didn't disappoint himself. That's not always guaranteed. A small pause. "And Eloise?" "She had a realization about written letters that she is still thinking about," Clara said. "I expect it will reappear in a lesson in a different form, in about 3 days. It usually works that way with her." He looked at her. She looked back. They were standing in the entrance hall of Ashmont Hall in the ordinary afternoon light, both slightly untidy from the outdoors, and the particular quality of the silence between them was not the silence of categories and distance. It was the silence of two people who have, over the course of weeks, been moving toward an honest conversation, and are now very nearly there. "Thank you," he said. It was direct and unelaborated. "It was a good day," she said. She went upstairs. He went back to his estate business. But something had shifted again, and both of them, in their separate ways, in their separate rooms of a very large house, were aware of it. The small sitting room adjacent to the library had become, without any formal decision being made, the place where Lord Harcourt and Clara met to talk. It had started with the first meeting about the French lessons, then a second one, about George's proposed investigation of the old stones, then a third, about some schoolroom materials that had arrived from outside the household, and after that the meetings had simply continued, because there was usually something worth discussing, and because both of them, though neither had said so directly, found the discussions worth having. The sitting room itself had changed. Not physically, it was still the room with the chairs at an angle to each other, the window looking onto the side garden, but it no longer felt forgotten. It felt used. There were 2 cups on the small table now. Someone had dusted the windowsill. Clara noticed these things in the way she noticed all things, carefully, without drawing conclusions that were not warranted. What she did notice, with the same care, was that the conversations themselves had changed character. In the beginning they had been about the children, their progress, their needs, their individual qualities, and the best ways to address them. Lord Harcourt asked good questions, and listened to the answers properly, which she had appreciated and noted. He was not a man performing interest, he was genuinely interested. But over the subsequent weeks, the conversations had begun to expand past the children, not into anything that crossed the proper boundaries of their positions. She was always aware of those boundaries, not uncomfortably but clearly, in the way you are aware of the walls of a room without needing to think about them. But the substance of the conversations had broadened. He asked her once about her time in France, not as an inquiry into her credentials but simply because they had been discussing Eloise's progress in the language, and he had asked what it was like to grow up with French as a daily reality, rather than a studied subject. She told him about the years in Lyon, about the market where her father bought bread, and the particular way the stallholder had spoken, that she had tried for weeks to replicate. She told him about the church, in the city, where she had first understood, at around age 8, that Latin was not a dead language but a living one, because the service sounded like something still happening, rather than something preserved. He listened to all of this with attention. He told her, in return, that he had spent time in Paris in his 20s, and had a moderate French that had faded from disuse, and that hearing her speak it had been a strange experience, the experience of recognizing something in a language that he had once known, and no longer quite did. She offered to help him recover it. She said this naturally, as she said most things, not as an offer with any subtext, but as the practical response of a person who can solve a problem and sees one worth solving. He had looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That would be useful." So that had begun as well. It was low-key and entirely practical. Once a week, on Thursday evenings after the children were in bed, Clara came to the small sitting room and spoke French with Lord Harcourt for approximately half an hour. She did not teach him the way she taught Eloise. He was an adult and had the structures of the language already in him, somewhat unused, requiring practice rather than explanation. She simply spoke, and he spoke back, and when he reached for a word, she waited to let him find it, and only offered it if the waiting went too long. Within 3 sessions, the rust was already clearing. The rest of the household was aware of this in the same way it was aware of most things, peripherally, collectively, without anyone saying it directly. Agnes had mentioned it to the kitchen maid. Mrs. Garland had heard and said nothing. Mr. Holt knew and kept it in his internal file under current household operations, unremarkable. Mrs. Doyle knew, and did not quite know what to do with the knowing. Clara, for her part, thought about it only in the way she thought about any teaching situation, as a problem of method, how much to correct and when, how much to demand in terms of effort, how to make the discomfort of reaching for an unfamiliar word into something productive rather than discouraging. These were questions she had answered for herself, with children, over many years, and was now finding had different answers for an adult who was also the person who employed her, which added a layer of calibration she found interesting. She managed it by being entirely consistent in the French sessions. She was exactly what she was in the schoolroom: clear, patient, precise, genuinely interested in the progress of the person in front of her, and entirely honest about where that progress stood. She did not soften assessments to make them comfortable. She did not harden them to make a point. She simply said what was true. He, in turn, responded to this the way he responded to accuracy in all contexts, with direct engagement. He was a good learner, she found, not a fast one, but a thorough one. He asked the right questions. He was not embarrassed by his errors, in a way that made him avoid making them, which was one of the most common obstacles in adult language learning. He made them, registered them, corrected them, and moved on. It was during the third Thursday session, at the end of June, that something happened that Clara noted and did not immediately know how to categorize. They had been speaking for about 20 minutes, mostly in French, about something Monsieur Delacroix had mentioned during his recent visit, a topic on which Lord Harcourt had a great deal of knowledge, and Clara had a reasonable amount. He had made a point in French, and she had responded in French, and they had then continued for several exchanges, in a way that was no longer language practice but simply conversation, before they both registered this simultaneously, and there was a brief pause. Then he said, "In English, I should tell you something." She looked at him. "The letter from Hartley," he said. "He mentioned the scholarly articles, the translations you provided." "Yes," she said. "The authors did not pay you." "No," she said. Hartley described this as inadequate. She said nothing, because she did not disagree. "I would like to make an adjustment to your position here," he said. He said it with the care of a man who has thought about how to say something for some time. "Not to the role itself. You are doing work that is clearly of substantial value, and I should have understood this earlier than I did. What I am proposing is a formal arrangement for additional work, if you are willing, that would be compensated properly. There are documents in several languages connected to the estate and to my various business interests that require competent translation. I have been sending them to an agency in London. The cost is significant, and the quality, I have found, is inconsistent." "You are saying you would like me to do it," Clara said. "Yes. If you are willing. It would be in addition to your current work with the children, not instead of it. And it would be paid work, at the professional rate." She was quiet for a moment. She was thinking clearly, the way she thought when something mattered. "What type of documents?" she asked. "Business correspondence primarily. Some legal material. The legal material would require review by a qualified solicitor, so your role would be translation only, not legal interpretation." She thought about this. "I can read legal French," she said, "and legal German. Legal Italian is less certain. The conventions differ from standard written Italian, in ways that I would want to be careful about." He nodded. "The majority of the material is French." "Then yes," she said. He said, "Good," and the matter was settled, in the direct way that both of them, she was beginning to understand, preferred to settle things. Afterward, walking back through the corridor to the east wing, Clara moved through the house with the particular feeling of a path becoming clearer underfoot. Not a dramatic change, not the kind of thing that announces itself with noise or light. Simply the quiet recognition that the shape of her life had shifted, meaningfully, in a direction that was better. She was being paid to do work she was capable of. She was being asked, by a man of intelligence who had initially missed her entirely, to apply what she actually was. The previous version of Ashmont Hall, the version where she had been furniture, where her languages were private and her intelligence was invisible, and her worth was measured only in how smoothly the schoolroom ran. That version was closing behind her. The new one was not yet fully formed. She did not know its exact shape, but she knew, in the way she knew things that were simply true, that it was being built from something honest, from what was actually there. In her room, she sat at the desk and wrote a long letter to her friend Dorothy Price, who had been the only other person at the Edinburgh tutoring circle with any real scholarly ambition, and who now lived in London and worked as a proofreader for a publisher who mostly did not know how capable she was. She told her about the translation work. She told her about the French sessions. She told her, briefly, and without detail but clearly, that the strange and complicated experience of being profoundly underestimated, and then slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely seen, was one she was still inside of, and did not yet know how to describe with full accuracy. "But it is happening," she wrote, "which is more than I expected, and more than the world generally offers. So I hold it carefully, and I keep working, because the work is what I can control, and the work is good. The rest, I watch with interest." She sent the letter. Then she went to bed. Outside, The June night was warm enough to keep the window fully open, and the kitchen garden below was very quiet, and somewhere in the old apple trees, a blackbird was giving its last few notes to the evening before settling into the dark. Clara listened to it with her eyes closed and felt, for a few clear moments, the full weight of what was true, that she was here, doing this, being this, that the work was good, that she had answered when spoken to, in 3 languages, without raising her voice, that something had changed, that it would keep changing. The letters between Lord Harcourt and Clara began in August, not letters of personal correspondence but professional ones, relating to the translation work, which had grown by midsummer to include not only business documents, but also the occasional more literary text, a letter in German from an art dealer, a long report in French about the condition of a property he was considering purchasing through an agent in Normandy. Clara translated all of these on the desk in her room, by candlelight when the candle was necessary, and by the window's light when it was not, and she delivered them to Lord Harcourt with a brief cover note indicating anything in the original text she felt required his attention, places where a word was ambiguous, where the register seemed different from the surrounding content, where she was uncertain of a technical term, and had provided 2 possible renderings. He acknowledged these notes consistently, and sometimes wrote back with a follow-up question. These exchanges were brief and correct and professional. But they were also, she noticed, a form of conversation. She said something, in the margins of a document. He responded. She responded to his response. There was thought on both sides, genuine thought, about the same material from 2 different angles, and the thinking met in the space of the text. She found this, she allowed herself to note, genuinely good. August at Ashmont Hall was different from the preceding months. Some of the household staff went on staggered leave. Lord Harcourt had visitors from London for 1 week, colleagues who came for 3 days to discuss business and spent considerable time in the study, and then the house was quieter. The children were on a looser schedule, the distinction between lesson time and free time softened by the summer. Clara used the quieter structure to let Eloise lead more. She told the girl one morning that today's lesson was hers to design. She should choose what they worked on, and for how long. Eloise had looked at her with suspicion, then with interest, then with the determined expression of someone taking a responsibility seriously. She had chosen French first, then natural science, and had proposed spending the afternoon learning something about the history of music, which she had been thinking about since Monsieur Delacroix's mention that music and arithmetic were connected, made during his visit 2 months earlier. She had not forgotten. She had been waiting. Clara taught the music lesson with the same pleasure she brought to anything that involved 2 subjects being found to be secretly related. She showed Eloise how a piece of music was structured mathematically, not in a way that made it cold or mechanical, but in a way that made the order inside it visible, the way looking at the right angle makes a pattern visible in something you had been seeing as random. Eloise's expression during this lesson was the specific look of someone having their mind reorganized in a way they are going to feel for a long time. George, who had been supposedly reading his river journal, had been listening for the entirety of the music lesson and said nothing about it except, at the end, when Eloise played a short piece on the small piano in the corner of the sitting room. "That's arithmetic?" "In a way," Eloise said. He looked at the piano. "I want to learn that too," he said. "We'll start Monday," Clara said. He sat back down with his journal, satisfied. That evening, after the children were in bed, Clara brought the latest translated document to the small sitting room, a letter in French about the Normandy property, long and detailed, with 3 places in the margins where she had added notes. Lord Harcourt was there, and he read the translation carefully, and then read her marginal notes, and said that the 3rd one, about a legal term she had flagged, was exactly the right thing to flag, and he had already put it to his solicitor. He said this without looking up from the document, the way you speak to someone whose competence you are no longer testing and simply using. She recognized the difference. It was not a small thing. They had a brief conversation about the property. He told her more about it than was strictly necessary for the translation work. And she realized he was explaining context, because he had found that she asked better questions when she had it. She asked 2 questions. He answered them directly. One of them produced a follow-up thought in him, something he had not quite finished forming until she asked. "You think well quickly," he said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation. I've had practice, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face had the quality of someone on the edge of saying something and choosing the right moment. He was a careful man. She had learned this over months, not careful in a hesitant way, but in the way of someone who says things deliberately and means them, and therefore does not rush. He said, I want to ask you something.
Ask.
She said. What do you want? He said. Not from this house, or this position. What do you want from your life? The larger version. She was quiet. Not because the question surprised her, she had asked it of herself many times, but because she was deciding how much of the honest answer to give. She decided on all of it. I want to write, she said. There are things I have been thinking and reading for years that I want to put into a form that will last. About language, how it moves, how it carries thought from one mind to another across time, what is lost and what survives. I began something in Edinburgh that I did not finish. I would like to finish it. He looked at her steadily. What is stopping you? Time, she said, and the practical difficulty of finding a publisher for the work of a woman in this area, and the question of whether I am right about what I think I know, which requires more reading and more testing. He nodded. He thought for a moment. The time, he said, is something that could be arranged, if you wish to use some hours here for your own work. She was still. The reading, he said. You have access to the library. Yes, she said. The publisher, he said, is more difficult. But Professor Hartley might have suggestions, and I have some connections in that world through a cousin who works in publishing. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the same direct attention he gave to everything. The estate, the translations, the children. She was receiving the same quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. You would help with that, she said. If you wanted it, he said. Yes. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silence had weight and presence. She was not being careful. She was simply fully present in what was being offered, not in what it might mean, not in its implications, or its edges, or its complexity, just in the fact of it. Someone had looked at her and seen what she was capable of, and asked what she wanted, and offered to help. In a world that had not generally done this, in a life that had asked her to be quietly capable and ask for nothing, this was a large thing. Thank you, she said. It was insufficient, and she knew it. It was also the only right thing to say. It is not a gift, he said. You have already given considerable value to this household. It is simply late recognition of that. She looked at him. He said things very precisely, she had found, and the precision was usually the most important part of what he said. Late recognition was not an accident of phrasing. Better late than not at all, she said. A small pause. Then, unexpected and entirely genuine, he smiled. It changed his face, in the way a smile does on a face that does not use it often, not transforming it, but revealing something that had been there all along. She held it for a second. Then she looked back at the translated document. There is one more thing in the Normandy letter I should tell you about, she said. The clause on the 3rd page. He turned to the 3rd page. The work continued. The summer turned into autumn, in the way that summers do at country houses. Not all at once, but in daily adjustments. The light shifting earlier, the mornings cooler, the garden beginning its retreat. Ashmont Hall prepared for autumn, with the efficiency it brought to all seasonal changes. Clara noticed the season changing the way she noticed all things, through specific details. The smell of the kitchen garden in the morning, which in September had something final in it. The smell of plants doing their last work before the cold. The way Eloise's French composition grew longer and more confident through October, as though the language was finding its full weight in her. The way George's journal had expanded to 6 volumes and was now accompanied by a careful index that he had created himself, which Clara had considered one of the most impressive things she had seen from a 6-year-old, and had told him so without any excess in the compliment. She had also begun writing. Lord Harcourt had arranged a small writing table to be brought to her room, slightly larger than the existing desk, not a grand gesture, quietly done, appearing one morning when she had come back from breakfast. She had stood looking at it for a moment, and then sat down at it, and written 3 sentences of what she had been thinking about for years, the long, slow-building argument about how language carried the past, and the sentences had come out correctly, not finished, not right yet, in all their parts. but pointed in the direction of true. She wrote when the children were occupied with independent work. She wrote in the evenings. She wrote on the large new table, with the draft pages spread out in a way her smaller desk had never allowed. The argument was taking shape. It was not fast work. It was the kind of work that required her to hold many things in her mind at once, and examine each one from different angles before putting it in place. Like fitting stones in a wall, where each stone affected how the next one would sit. She sent 3 pages to Professor Hartley in October. He replied within 2 weeks with comments that were precise and generous, and contained, buried in the 4th paragraph, the information that he had shown the pages to a colleague who was on the editorial board of a journal on classical and modern languages, and that the colleague had said he would like to see more. Clara read this letter sitting at the large table, and felt something move through her that was equal parts satisfaction, and a kind of relief, so deep it was indistinguishable from joy. She had been right. Not about everything. Hartley's comments showed her clearly where she was not yet right. But about the core of it. The argument was real. Someone had read it and seen it was real. She wrote to Lord Harcourt's cousin, Caroline Marsh, whose name and address she had been given. She wrote the letter carefully, explaining the work and what she was hoping to show, and sent it with 3 pages of the current draft. Then she went downstairs and taught Eloise's French lesson and George's arithmetic, and spent the afternoon in the garden, watching them, with the full attention of someone who is completely where they are supposed to be, doing what they were made for, in a life that is becoming, slowly and seriously, exactly itself. The reply from Caroline came in November. She was interested, very interested. She would like to meet, in London, at Clara's convenience. She had shown the pages to an editor at her publishing house, who had said the same thing Hartley's colleague had said, more. Clara told Lord Harcourt. He said, "When would you like to go to London?" She said, "January, if that suits the household." He said, "It suits the household." She wrote to Dorothy. The letter, for once, was not careful. It was long and slightly breathless, and it said, among other things, that the thing she had waited and worked for, and kept quietly alive through all the years of being looked past, was now, actually, visibly, beginning, that she did not know its full shape yet, that she was not yet certain of anything, but that the argument was real, and someone had seen it, and a door was opening. Dorothy wrote back, "I told you. I have always told you. Go through the door." Clara went to London in January. She went by train, which she had taken many times in her life, and which she found comforting in a way that she associated with her father. Trains had been the mechanism of their family's particular life, the journeys between places, the arrivals at new things. A train meant forward. It meant the next thing. She wore her best dress, which was not the grey wool, but a dark blue, that she had bought in Edinburgh and kept carefully. She carried her manuscript in a leather folder that had been her father's. She carried also, in her coat pocket, the mythology book, because she always carried it, the way other people carried particular small objects that kept them grounded in themselves. She met Caroline Marsh at her office in a narrow street off the Strand. Caroline was a woman of perhaps 40, with the specific quality of someone who had spent years in rooms where people underestimated her, and had long since arrived at a total calm about this, because the work spoke, and the work was good. She shook Clara's hand, and looked at her directly and said, "I've read the 30 pages twice. Tell me what happens next in the argument." Clara told her. She spoke for 40 minutes. Caroline listened the way good readers listen, not waiting for her turn but actually following the thought, asking questions that went to the exact place where the argument was most difficult to land. Clara answered the questions without defending herself or performing confidence. She simply went to the place the question pointed and found what was actually there, and said what she found. At the end of the 40 minutes, Caroline said, "We want to publish it." Clara was very still. "The full work," Caroline said, "when you are ready. Professor Hartley has offered to write a preface, which will be helpful. The market for this kind of work is not enormous, but it exists, and it reads. And the argument is one that, in my view, has not been made this way before." Clara said, "I am perhaps 2/3 of the way through the writing." "How long?" Caroline asked. 6 months, Clara said, "if I have the time to work." "Do you have the time?" "I am working to have it." Clara said. Caroline looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has heard similar answers many times and knows what they mean. Good, she said. Support is worth more than people admit. She stood. I'll have a letter of intent drawn up. You can take it with you and have a solicitor look at it before you sign. Thank you, Clara said. Thank yourself, Caroline said. I only publish what is already good. You made it good. Clara left the office into the cold January street and stood on the pavement for a moment. The city moved around her in its usual unconcerned way. Cabs and people and the particular energy of London in winter. Always too much happening at once. She thought, my father would have liked today. Then she went to meet Dorothy for lunch, and they talked for 3 hours, and Clara was loud and clear and laughed at several things, and Dorothy said she had never seen her quite like this, and Clara said she felt quite like this. She went back to Ashmont Hall on the late train. The house was quiet when she arrived, the children in bed, the staff gone to their evening routines. She carried her leather folder up to her room and set it on the large writing table and looked at it for a long time. The letter of intent from Caroline Marsh was inside it. So was the manuscript, which was no longer just something she was writing. It was, now, something that was going to exist in the world. She changed out of her blue dress and put on a simpler one and went downstairs. There was a light under the study door. She knocked. Come in, Lord Harcourt said. She opened the door. He was at his desk with papers, which was where he always was in the evening, but he looked up from them with the attention he always gave when she entered a room, which she had come to understand was not performance. It was simply the way he saw. She wants to publish it, Clara said. He set his pen down. The full work, she said, a letter of intent, 6 months to finish the manuscript. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, good. It was a single word, but in his register, the precise register of a man who said exactly what he meant, she had learned that good from him was the equivalent of something considerably larger from anyone else. I'll need the time, she said. I don't want to compromise the children's lessons. We'll find the time, he said. I'll need access to 2 additional texts that are not in your library. I can write to Edinburgh for them. Right, he said. And I would like to acknowledge you in the book, she said. For the library, and the space to work, it is honest to do so. He looked at her. Something in his face was difficult to name, not embarrassed, not pleased exactly, but the look of someone receiving something real, that they were not sure how to hold. You don't have to, he said. I know, she said. That's why I'd like to. A long pause. The fire in the study was low. Outside the window, the January night was very still. He said, when I spoke in French, in the drawing room, in April. She waited. I have thought about it often, he said, what it says about how I see people, what it says about habit and assumption, and the way categories become walls. She was quiet. I don't think I am fully past it, he said, those habits. I see them in myself sometimes, and I recognize them, and I am not always quick enough to stop them, but I am more aware than I was. That is what growth looks like, Clara said. It does not arrive all at once. He looked at her. You were generous that evening, he said, not to say more. I said what needed to be said, she replied. 3 languages was sufficient. The smallest possible silence. Then he did something she had seen very rarely. His expression shifted, the contained quality giving way for just a moment to something that was, unmistakably, amusement. Not a laugh, but the thing just before one. She felt it too, the same thing, lightness, arriving like a window opened in a room that needed air. Yes, he said. It was. She said good night and went back upstairs. She sat at the large writing table and opened the manuscript to the current page and read the last paragraph she had written, which described the way that words outlast the people who first spoke them. How a letter written 2,000 years ago could be read today by a girl in a garden who would say, "Someone touch this." She picked up her pen and wrote the next sentence. It came easily. It came the way things come when they are ready. Not without effort, not without care, but with the certainty of something that has found its proper place. She wrote for 2 hours. Then she set the pen down and looked at what she had made, and it was good. Outside, the January night was deep and still, and Ashmont Hall was quiet around her, breathing in the slow way of a place that has housed many lives and will house many more, keeping them, carrying them forward, in the way that only old things can. Not preserving, but continuing. The fire in her room was low. She did not rebuild it. She sat for a moment in the comfortable dark, with the pages in front of her, and the mythology book in her coat pocket, and the letter of intent in the leather folder, and the whole of what she was becoming, gathered around her like a country she had always been traveling toward, and had, this January, finally arrived in. She thought of Eloise saying, "The letters lasted longer than the people." She thought of George saying, "People exactly like us." She thought of her father reading to her in French, by a different fire, in a different house, in the years when the world was wide, and they were moving through it together, and everything she was being given would eventually become everything she needed. She thought of the drawing room in April, and herself, standing at the door in the gray dress, and speaking in 3 languages, and not raising her voice. She had answered. And everything since had been the long and serious and necessary work of building what comes after an answer, not a destination, not a resolution, but more. The continuing life of a person who has been fully seen, and has also fully seen, who has done the work and found it good, who has arrived at something true. She blew out the candle. She slept. And in the morning, the work continued.